verify, ready for launch. FTS.
FTS go.
Props go. AVI.
AVI's go.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to our live launch coverage of the GPS 3-7 mission. Falcon 9 is currently awaiting liftoff at 1:37 p.m. Eastern Time from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. Hello everyone, my name is Zachary Lupin and I'm an avionics supply chain engineer here at SpaceX.
And I'm Annie Tsui, a recovery operations engineer here at SpaceX. GPS 3-7 is our second accelerated launch for the government after the Rapid Response Trailblazer 1 mission in December 2024. This type of mission typically requires a 2-year planning cycle, but was condensed to 4 months for Rapid Response Trailblazer 1 and just 3 months for GPS 3-7.
Now, the Global Positioning System, or GPS, is a huge part of our lives. Billions of devices and systems around the world rely on the U.S. Space Force-provided GPS signals. Not only is it critical to national security technologies, but everything from navigation on smartphones and in cars, boats, and aircraft to disaster response, transportation systems, Federal Aviation Administration operations, and even ATMs and banking transactions. All of these depend on GPS. GPS-3 is the next generation of satellites required to maintain the resiliency of the GPS constellation and improve services to meet user demand. The satellite going up today will contribute to increasing the fidelity of GPS signals, improving resistance to jamming and cyber attacks, boosting military signal strength, and adding signals for civil applications.
SpaceX launched 9 military and defense missions in 2024 with the National Reconnaissance Office and the U.S. Space Force. In 2025, we've launched 5 and have 12 more missions with the NRO, Space Force, and Space Development Agency on our manifest. Today's spacecraft is a special one named in honor of Creola Katherine Johnson, the American mathematicians whose groundbreaking calculations of orbital mechanics were instrumental to the success of early human spaceflights from the U.S.
Wow, that's pretty awesome, getting a whole spacecraft named in honor of you. Now, this will be the 4th flight for the booster flying on today's mission, which previously supported CRS-32, a commercial resupply services mission to the International Space Station, another national security mission, NROL-69, in March, and a Starlink mission in February. And after stage separation, the booster will once again head back to Earth, this time targeting a landing on our drone ship, A Shortfall of Gravitas, which is currently stationed in the Atlantic Ocean.
So at about T-minus 11 minutes, we are looking good for an on-time liftoff. The vehicle is healthy, the range is ready to support, and the weather is holding steady with a 50% probability of weather-related launch constraints. If for any reason we are unable to launch today, a backup opportunity is available tomorrow at 1:18 p.m. Eastern Time.
So with everything on track, let's learn more about the Space Systems Command mission.
The ultimate high ground has no ground. The satellites in orbit around our planet provide the critical infrastructure we use to defend and protect the security and prosperity of this world we all share. But space is no longer a benign environment. Adversaries and near-peer nations are actively working to dominate the most critical battleground of our day. At Space Systems Command, the time to act is now. The race is on.
Our adversary is out there. They are going to work every day, trying to work harder, smarter, faster than us. But we are making sure that that does not happen.
The Guardians, airmen, and partners of Space Systems Command are working with unstoppable urgency to innovate and act now, delivering solutions to emerging threats, creating resilient space architectures we can all rely on, especially during times of crisis and conflict.
The fight could happen tonight, it could happen tomorrow, it could happen in a couple of years, but we need to start innovating now, and that's exactly what we're doing.
For Space Systems Command, working faster means breaking from the status quo, exploiting existing space architectures and capabilities in creative new ways, working with commercial industry, innovators and tech startups, and allied nations to exploit, buy, and build, to deliver better, faster, and more affordably.
We are advancing the space architecture that we have up there right now, making sure that it's optimal, making sure that we get new space architecture set up, prototyping, experiments, to ensure that we can outpace the enemy tomorrow.
To maintain our lead in space, Space Systems Command has embraced a new culture, empowering its people to race forward, speak up, and connect with industry in unprecedented new ways.
Our people are agile, they continue our partnerships, they are working collaboratively day after day in order to contribute to the big warfighter purpose.
Space is a team sport. We have to work together to provide integrated, resilient capability and speed in order to fight through any contingency or crisis.
Space Systems Command is moving fast to maintain U.S. superiority in space, running a marathon of sprints, thinking differently, acting boldly, empowering at every level to make space work for us all. At Space Systems Command, space starts here.
An incredible mission for sure. Turning back to the pad now, Falcon 9 is a two-stage rocket developed and manufactured by SpaceX, known for its safe, reliable, and cost-effective access to space. It was also the first orbital-class rocket capable of reflight.
Now, the two-stage Falcon 9 vehicle stands at 229 feet tall, and you can see it there on your screen. When it's fully fueled around the T-minus 2 minute mark, it'll be holding just over 1 million pounds of fuel and oxidizer.
Engine chill.
Starting from the top of the rocket is the payload fairing, which is a protective shell that encases the payload for a satellite being sent to space. The fairings are made up of a carbon composite material and have a 17-foot diameter, which contains enough space to accommodate an average-sized fire truck. The fairing, made up of two halves, will separate and jettison away from the vehicle, exposing the payload once Falcon 9 reaches space. You can see there on your screen a photo of today's payload being encapsulated about a week ago.
Now, once jettisoned, the payload fairing halves will be falling back to Earth.
Stage 1 fuel load is complete.
Good call out there. The fairing halves will fall back to Earth and splash down in the Atlantic Ocean, where they'll be recovered by our fairing recovery ship, Doug. And moving on down the rocket stack, we have the Falcon 9 second stage. The second stage is powered by a single Merlin vacuum engine, or MVAC engine, which is optimized to perform in the vacuum of space. After stage separation, the MVAC engine will ignite and carry the payload to its final orbit.
The second stage is connected to Falcon 9's first stage by the black composite inner stage, which houses the MVAC engine and the system that decouples the two stages during stage separation. Shortly after liftoff, the two stages of Falcon will separate. Stage 2 will continue to take the payload to its desired orbit, and Stage 1, also known as the booster, will return to Earth for recovery and reuse on a future mission. Falcon 9 uses a combination of engine burns to slow down, along with its 4 titanium grid fins to guide itself to landing. Below that is the first stage, which is powered by the 9 Merlin 1D engines. These provide the initial thrust to lift Falcon 9 off the ground through the lower, thicker part of the atmosphere.
And each of those
Tanks are
Merlin...
pressing for strong back retract.
Another good call out there. Each of those Merlin 1D engines delivers about 190,000 pounds of thrust at sea level, which gives Falcon 9 a combined 1.7 million pounds of thrust. Now, the Falcon 9 first stage is also equipped with 4 landing legs that'll deploy just before landing and allow for vertical touchdown on a drone ship or landing pad. As I mentioned earlier, today's booster is flying for its 4th time, and we'll be attempting to land it today on our drone ship, A Shortfall of...
Strong back retract has started.
Another good call out. We'll be attempting to land it on our drone ship, A Shortfall of Gravitas, which is currently stationed in the Atlantic Ocean. And on your screen right now, you can see the clamp arms opening around the Falcon 9 second stage. Right next to the rocket, you can see that large truss structure, which is the transporter erector, or TE, and it's used to roll the rocket out to the pad and raise it to vertical. It also routes the vehicle's fluids, power, and telemetry umbilicals from the ground systems to the rocket and satellite up until the moment Falcon 9 transitions to internal power. With just a few minutes remaining in the countdown, let's take a moment to hear from the United States Space Force, our customer for today's mission. Now, the payload continues to be healthy, and the Falcon 9 team is tracking no issues on the rocket. And as a reminder, weather is still a watch item for today's mission.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
And good call out there for Stage 2 LOX loading completion. Now, you may have noticed the white clouds around the rocket. Those clouds are formed as the chilled gas above the LOX tank liquid surface vents overboard to maintain pressure in the tank as needed. And when the gas comes out into the warmer Florida air, it condenses the water in the air and forms those clouds that you see there on your screen.
Ground gas load.
Another good call out there. Coming up at the T-minus 60-second minute mark, Falcon 9 will be in startup, and this means that the rocket's autonomous internal flight computers will have taken over the launch countdown. And just inside of T-minus 2 seconds, we'll light the M1D engines for liftoff.
In about
Falcon
15.
9 is in startup.
Good call out there. F9 is in startup. Stage 1 and Stage 2 begin pressuring for launch.
This is the mission director. Go for launch.
Great call out there. LD is go for launch. At about T-minus 30 seconds, all...
T-minus 30 seconds.
At T-minus 30 seconds, all systems are go for launch for today's mission.
Seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Engines full power, and liftoff. Go Falcon, go SpaceX, go GPS 37.
Vehicle's pitching downrange. Chamber pressure nominal.
At T plus 30 seconds and counting, Falcon 9 has successfully lifted off from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Now, during the rocket's ascent, we tilt or gimbal the engines, and that'll turn the rocket horizontally in a maneuver known as a gravity turn. So the rocket is still going up.
Power telemetry nominal.
Good call out there. So the rocket is still going up, but now it's also headed horizontally away from the launch pad.
Moments ago, we throttled the engines down on the first stage in preparation for max Q, or maximum aerodynamic pressure. This is a critical moment during flight
Vehicle is supersonic.
because the combined stresses caused by Falcon 9 accelerating through the atmosphere and the ambient static pressure are at their greatest.
Max Q.
Good call out there for max Q. The rocket typically needs to go about 17,500 miles per hour horizontally in order to avoid being pulled down to Earth and get into orbit.
And to give you an idea of the speed of the rocket, you can track our progress to orbit by keeping an eye on the Stage 1 telemetry at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Now we're going to have another good call out there. We're going to have several events coming up in quick succession, starting with main engine cutoff or MECO, stage separation, second engine start 1 or SES1, and fairing separation.
Main engine cutoff, or MECO, is where all 9 Merlin 1D engines shut down to slow the vehicle down in preparation for stage separation, which is where the first stage separates from the second stage. Followed by this, the MVAC engine on the second stage will light, which is called out as second engine start 1, or SES1.
Now this engine burn, lasting several minutes, will propel the second stage and the payload to orbit. In addition to these 3 major events, the fairing halves will separate shortly after SES1, so keep an eye out for all of these events coming up in just a few moments from now.
Nominal trajectory. MECO.
Stage separation confirmed.
MVAC startup.
And there you heard and maybe even saw those events that happened just back to back, which were again MECO, stage separation, and SES1. Coming up in just a few moments, we should hear the call out for fairing separation.
Fairing separation confirmed.
Good call out there for fairing separation and a beautiful view of Earth from space. As mentioned earlier, we will be attempting to retrieve these fairing halves using our recovery vessel Doug once they fall back to Earth.
And these are some absolutely phenomenal views today. Now, we're currently at the T plus 4 minute mark into today's mission. Next major milestone coming up will be just past the T plus 6 minute mark, which will be the first stage's entry burn. For the entry burn, we'll be relighting 3 of the M1D engines on the first stage, starting with the center E9 engine, followed shortly after by the E1 and E5 engines. This will help slow down the vehicle as it passes back into Earth's denser, lower atmosphere. We need to slow it down to reduce re-entry forces, which ultimately helps us recover and reuse the first stage.
During the entry burn, Falcon 9 is decelerating by firing its Merlin engines, but we're still moving really fast. This causes the vehicle to fly through Merlin's exhaust gases, and this deposits a layer of soot on the vehicle's surface, which is why our flight-proven vehicles look the way they do. That soot comes from the carbon-based fuel that Falcon 9 uses. As you can see on your screen, on the bottom left, the first stage is decelerating and heading to its rendezvous point at sea.
Now, reusability is, of course, key to lowering the cost of spaceflight, which enables more investment in critical scientific research. The Falcon 9 first stage that is supporting today's mission is
Two nominal trajectories.
Another good call out there. The Falcon 9 first stage that is supporting today's mission is flying for its 4th time. And while this booster is on its 4th trip to space, we're working towards qualifying our fleet of Falcon boosters and fairings to support 40 missions each. And for those following along, we're currently at 28 flights of a single Falcon booster, which is absolutely amazing. Increasing Falcon's flight count provides valuable information on repeated reuse, which is a critical element for making life multiplanetary. Coming up in just about 15 seconds from now, we should hear that call out for the first stage entry burn startup.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
And great call out there for entry burn startup of the Falcon 9 first stage. And you can actually see which engines are lit with that graphic at the lower left-hand corner of your screen.
Stage 1 FTS is saved.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
And great call out there for entry burn shutdown of the Falcon 9 first stage.
The Merlin engines on the Falcon's first stage are optimized for sea leveling, and these achieve 190,000 pounds of thrust during ascent and descent. And while it won't be visible on this webcast, the single MVAC engine on the second stage has a much wetter nozzle and is optimized to operate in space, producing 220,000 pounds of thrust in vacuum. Coming up in a couple moments, we will have the landing burn of the first stage. The landing burn is the final burn of the Falcon 9 booster used to reduce the remaining speed of the vehicle in order to allow for a soft touchdown on the drone ship.
Now, this will be the 4th landing burn of this booster. As I mentioned earlier, this booster previously supported CRS-32.
Stage 1 transonic.
Another good call out there. This booster
Stage 2 has entered terminal guidance.
And another good call out. So this booster previously supported CRS-32, a commercial resupply service mission to the International Space Station, a separate national security mission, NROL-69, and 1 Starlink mission.
Stage 2 FTS is saved.
Stage 1 landing burn.
And there's that call out for landing burn startup of the Falcon 9 first stage.
Landing leg deploy.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And there you saw and heard the call out.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
There you saw and heard the call out for successful landing of our Falcon 9 rocket. We also heard the call out for SECO 1. Again, this was the 4th launch and landing for this first stage.
And the second stage is now embarking on its first coast phase, which will last about an hour before a second restart of Merlin vacuum engine, also known as SES-2. We're going to take a break during that coast, and we'll return just before SES-2. See you then.
and welcome back to our live launch coverage. If you're just joining us, we are in the middle of the GPS 3-7 mission for our customer, the United States Space Force. We had an on-time liftoff at 1:37 p.m. Eastern Time from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida.
And the first stage booster successfully landed for its 4th time on our drone ship, A Shortfall of Gravitas. Now we're waiting for a second restart of the Merlin vacuum engine, also known as SES-2, any moment now. This burn will be the final burn for the MVAC engine prior to stage deployment. Let's listen for that call out. As a reminder, the MVAC engine is on the Falcon 9 second stage and features a much wider nozzle than the 9 M1D engines located on the booster.
MVAC ignition.
Good call out there. Now this burn is expected to last less than 1 minute before the MVAC shuts itself down for the second time, or what we refer to as SECO-2.
Falcon 9's Merlin vacuum engine features a larger exhaust section and a significantly larger expansion nozzle to maximize the engine's efficiency in the vacuum of space. Its combustion chamber is regeneratively cooled, while the expansion nozzle is radiatively cooled.
At full power, the Merlin vacuum engine operates with the greatest efficiency ever for an American-made hydrocarbon rocket engine.
MVAC shutdown.
And with that, the second stage is beginning its second coast phase of the mission, after which is payload deploy.
Now, deployment is coming up in just under 30 minutes from now, so we're going to take another break and leave you with some space
Nominal
jams.
payload orbit insertion.
Good call out there for nominal payload orbit insertion. We'll be leaving you with some space jams as the second stage prepares to deliver GPS 3-7 to orbit. So we'll see you back here just around the T+1 hour and 27-minute mark.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the GPS 3-7 mission for the United States Space Force. Before the break, the second stage Merlin vacuum engine performed its second start and shutdown to position itself for payload deployment.
And the GPS 3-7 payload is expected to separate from the second stage in just a few moments. Now, as we mentioned earlier, billions of devices and systems around the world rely on the U.S. Space Force provided GPS signals. And GPS 3 is the next generation of satellites required to maintain GPS constellation resiliency and improve services to meet user demand.
And today's mission will help increase the fidelity of the GPS signal, improve resistance to GPS jamming and cyber attacks, boost military signal strength, and add civil signals.
Now, as a reminder, this satellite is named after Creola Katherine Johnson, the American mathematician whose groundbreaking calculations of orbital mechanics were instrumental to the success of early human spaceflights from the United States. We've got payload deployment coming up in just about 50 seconds from now, so let's sit back and watch as GPS 3-7 is deployed into orbit.
Payload deployment is coming up in about 10 seconds, and you can see a beautiful view on your screen of the payload here.
Payload separation confirmed.
And there's that call out for payload deployment.
And that wraps up our launch coverage for this mission. GPS 3-7 is our second accelerated readiness launch for the government after the Rapid Response Trailblazer 1 mission in December 2024. And we have 12 more missions for the NRO Space Force and the Space Development Agency on our manifest this year.
All of us here at SpaceX would like to thank the United States Space Force for entrusting us with today's mission. We also want to thank the Eastern Range and Federal Aviation Administration for supporting today's launch. And a big thanks to all of you for your support and for tuning in to today's mission.
Remember to follow at SpaceX on X for launch updates and check spacex.com/launches for more. And we'll see you here again very soon.